This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. I'm recording this on Monday, July 24th, and this has been a scary summer, weather-wise, temperature-wise. It has been reported that the last several weeks were likely the hottest weeks in Earth's recorded history. Recently, a heat wave descended simultaneously upon the United States, several European countries, and parts of China. Books about climate change have become their own cottage industry, and appropriately so given the reality of the world before us. This overheated summer, we've reviewed several of those books at the Book Review. In Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world, John Valiant tells the tale of the massive 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire, one of the many predecessors to the blazes consuming parts of Canada this summer. There's The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, in which David Lipsky sketches a soup-to-nuts saga of how he got here. Incidentally, the book takes its title from a New York Times story from 1956. 1956, headlined, "Warmer Climate on the Earth may be due to more carbon dioxide in the air." And then there is The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet by Jeff Goodell. Goodell, who previously wrote the book The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, lays out the many ways in which rising temperatures will affect us, the cities and communities we live in, and the animals and plants that surround us. Today, I speak first to Jen Szalai, our nonfiction book critic, who reviewed The Heat Will Kill You First. She talks about that book and several other books about natural history. And then after the break, Goodell himself talks about his new book, why he wrote it, and how he put it together. Jen Szalai, welcome back to the Book Review Podcast.
Hi, Gilbert. Thanks for having me.
You were last on in March, where you talked a little bit about The Remains of the Day by Ishiguro. Do you remember?
Right.
Long ago?
Now I remember. Yes, I do remember.
But most of the time, you're not reading fiction for professional reasons because you're the nonfiction critic here.
Exactly.
And as a result, you often review books about politics and current events. You write about the history of philosophy, you write about technology, and you review many books about science and the natural world. And I want to talk to you about several that you've reviewed in the past 6 weeks. And I want to start with one that feels particularly appropriate for what's happening this week around the world, which is a book called The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodell. You write of that book that Goodell's stripped-down style suits his subject. This is a propulsive book, one to be raced through. Tell us a little bit about it.
Goodell is a journalist who has written a number of books about climate change. His last book was The Water Will Come, which was about rising sea levels. He reports about climate change for Rolling Stone. And the title, as I say, is very, very unsubtle. And the book itself is not subtle. I mean, essentially what he's arguing is that with climate change, we will experience all across the world extreme weather patterns and especially extreme heat, which is particularly dangerous to human beings, to living creatures, essentially because we have adapted to live in a world of mostly moderate temperatures or temperatures within a certain band. And so the idea that you would have weeks of temperatures reaching 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, like what we've been seeing in, say, Phoenix, would not be something that our bodies are used to. He goes through what heat does to the body, and it's not pretty.
He talks about the Goldilocks zone.
Yes.
What is the Goldilocks zone?
So the Goldilocks zone is essentially, that zone of temperate conditions that we've been adapted to not just flourish under, but to just exist under. And this is the idea that above a certain temperature, what can happen is that your body starts going into this condition where things start breaking down. Not only can it be dangerous, it can be deadly to people.
Goodell analyzes this problem of extreme heat through several different lenses. He talks about how it affects plants. He talks about how it affects oceans. He talks about how it affects the ice in Antarctica. He talks about how it affects animals. But all of these things eventually have an effect on us, on humans. And it's full of science. It's full of anecdotes. I was wondering if there were a few that stood out to you.
He begins with this particularly startling, upsetting story of this family of three, two parents and their 1-year-old daughter, who were taking a very routine hike for them in the Sierra Nevadas near Mariposa. And, the morning started out, they went also with their dogs. So there were 4 of them. And the morning started out pleasant enough. I think the temperature was in the 70s. And what ended up happening is essentially this family for a while seemed to have disappeared until a few days later, their bodies were found and all of their deaths were attributed to extreme heat because by the middle of the day, one of them tried to text a friend saying, "We've run out of water. The temperature is really hot," because they were on a part of the mountain where the sun was just beating down on the rock. Essentially, it ended all of their lives. This is the story that he starts out with, I think, to show, first of all, how people who were experienced hikers could essentially get into this situation and that it can happen very quickly, essentially bearing out what he says in the title, which is the heat will kill you first.
There's, as I said, a lot of scenarios and stories that he presents in the book. One of them that really jumped out to me, maybe because, again, I didn't remember it happening. It happened in 2003. I was a young man then, so maybe I wasn't reading the news as much as I am now, and I certainly was not traveling through Europe that year, but there was a giant heat wave across Europe, and it was particularly bad in France. And in August 2003, it was not a great time to be in Paris.
Especially if you were somebody who lived on the top floor of one of these beautiful Parisian buildings that have these zinc roofs that essentially turn into frying pans when they're heated up to the extent that they were heated up in that summer because the city wasn't built for that kind of heat. And so what Goodell shows is that the people who were living in those garret apartments were very vulnerable. A lot of elderly people died, especially because they didn't necessarily have ways of getting out. And it's a city where you don't have air conditioning because you never really needed it before.
I imagine you have read other books about the effects of climate change. This book is already a bestseller on the list that the New York Times runs. Why do you think something like this is resonating at this moment?
Goodell's book happened to coincide with what we're seeing happening right now around the world, which is these extreme heat waves that have been deadly to people, have been prolonged, I think, in a way that has surprised a lot of people. And they happened to have converged all at once at one time. And they're happening early in the year, too, for a lot of places. And so to have a book come out right in this moment, people want to have a sense of why this is happening. And Goodell, he's very clear, this has to do with man-made climate change.
Which is something that he wrote about in his last book, which was about the rising seas. But it really does feel like in this book, he arrives at one of the roots of it all. Seas are rising because it is hot. Heat waves, wildfires in Canada, the smoke of which comes down on the East Coast, all of these things are really related to increased temperature and the effects that that has on both humans and the natural world.
Yes, and showing how all of these are really intricately connected. I think that that's very important to him because the problem of climate change is one that's enormous and it affects every aspect of life.
Now, the next book that you recently wrote about overlaps a little bit with the idea of climate change and extreme heat. You wrote in your review of the book Blight, Fungi and the Coming Pandemic by Emily Monison. Some fungi may be evolving to tolerate higher temperatures. She explains how valley fever caused by fungal spores in the soil of the Southwest is more likely to spread as the climate changes. Now, this is a relatively slim and very specific book, but tell us a little bit about it and who might be interested in it.
First of all, I think she's touched on a subject that has had this interesting pop cultural moment the last few years. There's this show, The Last of Us, which is based on a video game, which is all about essentially this deadly fungal pandemic. there has also been this interest on the more benign side about mushrooms and all the possibilities that the fungal world opens up in terms of new kinds of materials that are compostable that we can use for all kinds of human ends. The way that mushrooms, not only being something delicious to eat, but they also open up portals to new ways of thinking that creatures are connected. So this book is taking the darker stance. And when I first started it, she opens it up very shrewdly with the idea of, as you mentioned, Gilbert, that humans might be vulnerable to fungal pandemics in a way that perhaps they weren't before, partly because of climate change. That's terrifying to a lot of people, understandably. But what she gets into is really the big threat when it comes to fungi have to do with plants, which of course have an effect on humans since our whole agricultural industry is based on plants. But she talks a lot about the way that fungal blights work on plants and how climate change is actually exacerbating the problem.
Now, if the heat will kill you first is sort of a terrifying, depressing, scary, but rip-roaring journey through how heat is affecting us, what is the tone and the feel of reading Blight, Fungi in the Coming Pandemic?
I would say it's much more measured.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, Goodell is a very different kind of writer. There's this like hard-boiled aspect to like, okay, this is going to happen, then people die. Mm-hmm. Whereas Monifson, I think she was trained as a toxicologist. She's written other books on natural history, but she's just a very different kind of writer and a different kind of storyteller. So it doesn't have the same immediacy, but I don't think that that's really her purpose. I do think that Goodell very, very specifically is trying to sound an alarm. I mean, that's part of the purpose of his book. Monifson wants people to be aware of the potential of fungal blight, but she's also trying to explain to people what fungi are, what blight is. There's a lot more introductory work, I think, that you have to do with a book like that. Whereas Goodell, I mean, he's talking about something that we all know what it is, essentially, because we've all experienced some form of it.
The author talks about how blight affects plants, but there are also a few very dramatic stories having to do with animals. She writes of the great frog die-off, which I thought was a particularly striking phrase. She also writes about something that I feel I've seen touched on here and there, which is white nose.
I think it's white nose syndrome
on bats.
Yes, yeah. There are certain animals that are more vulnerable to fungal infection. Actually, ironically, since we're talking about the heat book, one of the reasons that humans traditionally, unless you're immunocompromised, one of the reasons that humans traditionally haven't been vulnerable to too many fungal infections is because we run hot. And so a lot of fungal infections, they really flourish under cooler conditions. And so the fact that we run hot has tended to protect us, whereas frogs don't run hot. Bats usually do run hot, but when they hibernate during the winter in their caves, their body temperature goes down. And so, she talks about these bat die-offs essentially that have happened because during their hibernation become vulnerable to fungal infections. And the thing about fungal infections is that it's on a tiny spore and they can spread very quickly. One of the things she says is that once a fungal infection is out there, it never really goes away. It continues to live in some form or another. And so trying to reverse it, control it, can be very difficult.
One of the words I can't say I'd ever seen before, but I read in your review, has to do with a bat's hibernation. It is hibernaculum.
Yes. Yeah. I was not familiar with that word either, and I really liked it.
And what is a hibernaculum?
A hibernaculum is the place where a bat hibernates. So it's essentially their bat cave. And I just think it's a great term. It's very evocative.
Do all animals that hibernate have hibernaculums?
I'm not sure.
We should look this up.
We should look it up. We should fact check it. I don't want to spread misinformation, so I'm not going to say for sure. But I just think it's such a perfect word for a bat's hibernating place.
Jen, the third book that you have written about recently is called What an Owl Knows, the New Science of the World's Most Enigmatic Birds. This is a book about owls. Owls are cool. They're weird. They look amazing. They look scary. There's a lot of mythology. There's a lot of sort of associations with owls. Tell us a little bit about this book.
One of the things the author Jennifer Ackerman points out is that owls have this cultural significance, and it varies according to the social context. So in some places, owls are considered symbols of wisdom. In my review, I mentioned that my daughter, at one point, somebody had given her this coat that had these little owl silhouettes on it. And I realized that the assumption is that owls are cute. I mean, they're nice and sweet and good. Whereas in some cultures, they're considered harbingers of illness and death. And so one of the things that Ackerman says is that this is partly because owls, first of all, they're very recognizable. Even though there are many different species of owls, the sort of overall shape of them, their huge eyes, they're often very silent flight. The fact that they often hide, I think also, so they're extra mysterious, adds to this whole cultural aura.
You write in your review that the new science that Ackerman refers to in her subtitle is talking about the ways in which we've been able to observe owls as a result of greater technology, cameras, drones, satellite transmitters, DNA analysis. What has it allowed us to see?
It's allowed us to see how owls act in the nest, things that before just wouldn't have been available to us. It's allowed us to have a greater sense of migration patterns, which again wouldn't have been available before the satellite transmitters, and to also get a sense of, through migration patterns, how that is affected by, as we were talking before about the changing climate, that has had an effect because it affects the availability of prey. And so accordingly, the owls have to travel differently in some cases.
I have a feeling I'm not going to be able to convince you to hoot in all the different ways that you write about and all the different ways that owls can make sounds. You write, quote, "The hoot of an owl will vary wildly. There's the woo. No. There's the woo of the long-whiskered owlets and the human-like scream of the fearful owl. Then there's the barking owl's woof woof. There are even differences within species. Burrowing owls in Oregon call with a monotone cuckoo, whereas the calls of burrowing owls in Maringa, Brazil sound more like Kukia? I can't do it, but
I do recommend for anybody listening who's curious, they should do what I did, which is look up these different owl sounds, and you'll find a bunch of clips on YouTube, and they're amazing. I mean, the one that I said sounded like a dog actually does sound like a dog. I was shocked.
One of the books on our top 10 books of 2022 list last year was An Immense World by Ed Yong, which was about animal senses and about how animals perceive the world differently than we do. You've written about a lot of books about animals. What makes a good book about animals?
I think when the author has a sense of curiosity and discovery, and they're able to convey it in such a way to make you, the reader, excited about it. I mean, that is the key to a good book about the animal world.
Jen, I would like to ask you for one book that you're reading now that is not a nonfiction book.
Oh, actually, so with some friends, we're reading, this is a book that I've read a very long time ago, but we're reading Madame Bovary, which is just heartbreaking. Yeah, it's sort of an interesting book to read during the summer, especially. It doesn't really feel like a summer read, but it's also fascinating to come back to it because I have to say, it's one of those books that there are certain moments where they stood out to me so clearly in the past and you come across them again. And then there are other huge plot points that I completely forgot about. So it's been a nice experience.
I love that we ended this conversation with you recommending Madame Bovary. For our listeners who are not writing down the titles of the books we just discussed, those are The Heat Will Kill You First by Jeff Goodell, Blight, Fungi, and the Coming Pandemic by Emily Manassan, and What an Owl Knows, The New Science of the World's Most Enigmatic Birds by Jennifer Ackerman. Jennifer Szalai, thank you so much for being on again.
Thanks so much, Gilbert.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Gilbert Cruz, and this is the Book Review Podcast. I'm now joined by Jeff Goodell, author of The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Jeff, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
So, Jeff, your previous book was titled The Water Will Come, and this one is The Heat Will Kill You First. You're not really messing around with the titles here. They feel, unfortunately, appropriately blunt. How did you decide to move from rising seas to extreme heat?
That's a good question. It wasn't planned that way. I didn't have a 2-book cycle in mind. I finished The Water Will Come, and then I was thinking about what to do next. And I happened to be in Phoenix on a really hot day, not unlike today. And I took a walk through downtown for 10 or 12 blocks, and it was really hot, and I got dizzy and felt my heart pounding. And I realized that heat was dangerous. And that was a striking idea to me because I'd been thinking about heat as a climate journalist for a decade or so. But it never occurred to me that it was immediately dangerous to me and to my life. And that was the genesis of the book. I thought this is an interesting thing to explore because even though I think about heat all the time, I didn't really understand it very much at all.
Like other parts of the world, Phoenix is currently experiencing record heat. The day we're talking is expected to be the 25th straight day of temperatures above 110 degrees. You write in the prologue to your book that in Phoenix, quote, heat owns the city. And it sounds like from your sort of genesis story from this book, you learned that firsthand. What are you thinking as we sit in the midst of multiple heat waves across the planet?
I'm thinking about how, in a personal way, I'm thinking about how eerie it is in the sense that I had that walk I just described in Phoenix about 4 years ago, and I've been working on this book for 4 years. And for it to be out now at this moment when we have these searing heat waves around the world is at once a kind of vindication of the kind of direction that I was going with the book, but also just plain spooky. And it's sometimes feel like I'm living in my own Stephen King novel. And on the other hand, I often feel also that this is a privileged moment because people are paying attention and talk about these things in a way that I think focuses the mind more than other times.
You write, in this book, my goal is to convince you to think about heat in a different way. The kind of heat I'm talking about here is not an incremental bump on the thermometer or the slow slide of spring into summer. It is heat as an active force, one that can bend railroad tracks and kill you before you even understand your life is at risk. I think one of the things I felt in reading this book is that for something that is so omnipresent, heat, something that I personally do not enjoy at any temperature, I don't really understand it. How did you go about trying to, as you say, convince us to think about heat in a different way?
It's interesting that you say that, you didn't understand heat. I have to say I didn't either. I have been writing about climate change for a decade when I took that walk that I described. And one of the things I thought about after that walk is that what is heat? I knew what temperature was, but I didn't really understand what heat was. And that was one of the things that made me think that this might be a book-worthy idea, is to explore what heat is. And the shorthand version, I won't keep anyone in suspense, heat is basically the vibration of molecules. As things get hotter, they vibrate more. And when you feel something that's hot, you're feeling something that is vibrating faster. And I thought of it as, I began to understand it as this sort of, not just this force that could put our lives at risk and had immediate impacts on our survivability, but really shapes the world that we live in and has shaped the world that we live in. And this notion that everything around us has evolved in this sort of, what scientists call this sort of Goldilocks temperature zone, and that we're moving out of that temperature zone, and the implications of that for all living things, in fact, non-living things, and including our iPhones, as anyone who's been out on a hot day knows, are really profound. And that's what I wanted to explore in the book.
So people die during heat waves. They die because they can't afford air conditioning, or they die because they keep working outside in an unair-conditioned place, or because they don't understand the warnings of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. How does the human body react, and what are the things that people should be looking for and be worried about?
Our bodies are really good at regulating temperature. Having a temperature that is steady and ranges around 98.6, 99 is really important to all of our functions in our body, the chemistry, our metabolism, all of that. Our only real thermal regulatory system for cooling ourselves off when it gets hot is sweat. And so when the temperature outside is hot and our inner body temperature starts to rise, our heart starts beating faster and pushing the blood out away from the internal organs towards the surface of the skin, where then our skin squirts water onto the surface of our skin, and that evaporates and that cools off our skin and the blood below it. And that's the mechanism that we have. And it works pretty well until it doesn't. And then when it's too hot or it's too humid outside for the sweat to dissipate, to evaporate, then our body temperature starts to rise. And what happens when our body temperature starts to rise, our heart starts pounding faster and faster. It gets more and more desperate to push the blood out to cool things down. It's really important when you are experiencing that, when you're out in the heat and you feel your heart pounding, often you feel lightheaded because the blood is moving away from your brain as it's getting pushed out towards your skin. You need to get out of the heat. The cure for extreme heat is to cool off. And for workers, for anybody who's out on a walk, you need to get out of the heat. And you need to, whether it's just finding shade, whether it's getting into an air-conditioned place, whatever that method is, you need to get out of it.
You start the book by writing about a young family who died in 2021 after going on a hike with their 1-year-old daughter and their dog in the Sierra Nevadas. And you also write about Sebastian Perez, a man who died while working in Oregon's Willamette Valley after migrating to the U.S. from Guatemala through Mexico. There are several other stories, personal stories, tragic stories in this book. How did you find those stories, and why was it important for you to include those stories?
I found those stories the way journalists like myself often find stories, by reading media. I think in both cases, they were both covered by local papers, and I happened to see the coverage. I think in the case of Sebastian Perez, some people from the United Farm Workers alerted me to it also. So I began to look into them and, to see how interesting they were, to what degree were they emblematic of the kind of risks that I wanted to talk about in the book. And I really wanted to make this personal. I'm interested in telling stories, and telling stories of someone like Sebastian Perez, who lived in Guatemala and got married and wanted to start a family with his wife, but couldn't get a job that would pay enough money to build a house or anything. And so came to America, that whole journey coming to America, ending up in the Willamette Valley, a kind of idyllic place. That's where Steve Jobs worked when he was working on an Apple farm that resulted in the name of Apple Computer. That narrative really appealed to me. And I think that I tried to structure this book around storytelling and evocative storytelling. And that story just seemed very American to me, and very, very typical and very tragic.
You also have a sentence at one point in which you write, "I have to take you on a brief detour into the world of atmospheric dynamics, which is the next frontier of heat wave science." How did you manage to achieve the balance between the personal, as you say, those really moving stories, and the scientific, in which the details are so extremely important?
And that's the heart of the difficulty of writing a book like this, because I have to be a translator of complex science. And I'm not a scientist. I was an English major. And I think that is one of the virtues of not being a kind of educated expert in the classic sense, but a very curious inquisitor. I've spent a lot of time with climate scientists. I have tremendous respect for them. I've known the best climate scientists in the world over the last 20 years. But I always approach it as, explain this to me, and can you make this simpler for me? And I really see my role as taking this complex science and really trying to put it into the language that my neighbor and my mom and my sister and my wife and my kids can understand. Climate science is very easy to get lost in details and graphs and charts and measurements that most people don't understand. And I think that this is such an important story that my job is to try to turn that into everyday language.
How long have you been covering climate for, and how has both the work that you have done and the reception to that work changed over that time?
I grew up in Silicon Valley. I worked at Apple Computer in the very early days. I knew Steve Jobs when he was running around barefoot and shouting Bob Dylan lyrics. I got into journalism. I had never planned to do that. I moved to New York City and fell into journalism. And I covered cops and crime and urban city stories for a couple of years. And then, actually the New York Times Magazine called me and asked me to write about the comeback of the coal industry in 2000 when George W. was elected. And I had no idea that we burned coal in America at that time. I thought that was something that happened in Charles Dickens novels. But it really opened my eyes to the consequences of where our energy comes from and climate change and all of the things that go on behind this sort of screen on our shiny computers in this Silicon Valley world that I grew up in. I had no idea where these electrons came from. And that was a very profound realization for me. I started writing about climate change in 2000. And at that time, it was still something that was seen as a tree hugger thing. It was something that was marginal. I often joke that when I told people I was writing about climate change and things, it was like I was writing about the sex life of porcupines or something. It was some sort of niche thing that was interesting and cute, but not really central to anyone's life.
I cannot imagine anything more niche than what you just said. But.
And now it's the central conversation of our time. And I feel that personally. Everywhere I go, as soon as someone through conversation or whatever finds out that I write about energy and climate change, they want to know, where should I move? Or what should I invest in? Or how afraid should I be? Or the classic, are we doomed? But it's connected to everyone's life now. And so I've watched this story move from the sort of the shadows, as it were, up into this sort of central theme. And for me, it's been a real privilege and strange and hopeful to see it become so much central to our culture, even if we're not doing enough and all of that kind of thing.
And of course, no one should take your advice on where to move because you moved to Texas.
I did, which shows the strangeness of migration. When people talk about extreme heat, they often point out that Phoenix is the fastest growing metropolitan area in the country, and Austin is close behind, and they're extremely hot places. People are moving to low-lying areas of the Gulf Coast. Florida is booming. They're moving towards hazards and not away from them. And these decisions about where we live are very personal. And some of this is being driven simply by the fact that in general, people like warmer places than colder places. In general, a lot of these places that are fast growing like Austin and Phoenix have had relatively cheaper real estate. There's things like no state income taxes in Texas that have brought a lot of people here. But for me, it was love. I fell in love with a woman who I was living in upstate New York in Saratoga Springs. I fell in love with a woman who lived and worked in Austin, and I decided I wanted to be with her. And so I moved to Austin, and that trumped all of the sort of climate lifestyle considerations.
You could look at all the science you want until you meet the person that you want to be with.
Exactly.
You write about so many things here. You write about the way that heat affects plants, the way that heat affects animals, the way that heat affects the ice at the bottom of the world. You write about all these things that sort of circle around how heat, in the end, affects humanity. I thought it was interesting that you wrote a book first about the rising seas, and then you get to the source of it all, which is the hotter it gets, the higher the seas go. How do you see those two books working together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question that, of course, was never in the forefront of my mind. I didn't think about exactly how they fit together when I was thinking about this book about heat. But now I do see how they fit together. And heat is the primary driver behind all of the climate impacts that we think about and know about and are talked about all the time that we're experiencing now, like wildfires, bigger, hotter wildfires, obviously drought, these extreme precipitation events, extreme rainfall like we just had in the Northeast, bigger, stronger hurricanes. All this stuff is driven by heat and by the rising temperatures on the planet. And so in a way, this heat book is a sequel to the sea level rise book because it's like the story of what's behind the curtain. I didn't really deal with heat in an explicit way in my book about rising seas. I talked about melting glaciers and things, but I didn't really grapple with the whole notion of heat the way I did here. So it's sort of like the kind of hidden engine off stage that was driving that other book.
There are many things I took away from this book, but one of the things that I really focused on personally has to do with this quote. You write, "In a world of heat-driven chaos, heat exposes deep fissures of inequity and injustice. Poverty equals vulnerability." You talk about how things are likely to get worse. And there are people in the world who won't really feel the effects of things getting worse because they are in an economic position to not have to work outside, to not have to work in an unair-conditioned warehouse, to not have to be in the place where they ever really suffer from the most extreme heat that the planet is going to offer. I'd love for you to unpack a little bit this question of, as the world becomes less sustainable, who suffers the greatest burden?
That's one of the really important and difficult aspects of thinking about the consequences of this extreme heat is that heat really is predatory. All living things that are most vulnerable will be impacted first and hit first. And I see that here in Austin, where I live. You go into the wealthy neighborhoods and everyone's got big pecan or oak trees in their front yards, and there's lots of shade, and they have big houses with air conditioning and Teslas parked in the driveway. And then you go to the east side of Austin and there's no trees and people sitting in lawn chairs out front and sometimes waving fans or sitting in front of maybe an electric fan trying to cool off. Wealth buys coolness. And that is a simple truth that is true throughout the world. So as we get into these more extreme kind of temperature events and things get hotter and hotter, the people who are going to be in trouble and who are going to die are the people who don't have air conditioning or in some cases just can't afford to turn it on. People who work outside, people who are delivering your packages. It really opens up what I call in the book this divide between the cool and the damned. And it's a very politically destabilizing aspect of the kind of world we're creating because the politics of this are very volatile.
I love to talk to nonfiction authors because there's always stuff that they weren't able to put in their book. But I do want to ask you about something that might be in your book that you thought was particularly fascinating, an anecdote, a story, a fact. There are so many in The Heat Will Kill You First.
That's an interesting question. You know, one of the things that sticks with me that I think is just, I don't know how to contextualize it or explain quite why it's so fascinating to me, but it speaks to something deeply in our human nature is that there's been a number of studies about what temperature do people keep their houses at? You know, if they have a choice to air condition the houses to any temperature, where do they keep it? This study showed that the sort of preferable temperature for people is 72 degrees. And this one researcher that I talked to, and at a certain level of sort of low humidity, and a researcher that I talked to looked around the world to see what region most mimics the temperature and humidity levels that people like to keep their house at. And turned out to be the Rift Valley in Africa, which is basically the cradle of human civilization. And so in our air conditioning of our modern houses and in this climate we create for ourselves, we're recreating the conditions that we evolved out of as humans. And I just find that to be endlessly fascinating.
How should we feel going forward? This is a book that is heavy, that's a little scary, but you say at the end that you still feel hopeful about what might be. Talk to us a little bit about that.
This is a scary book, and it's meant to be scary, not in an alarmist way, but in the sense that this is happening to us here, to us now. Before we can really talk about solutions, which are really important and of which there are many, we have to grasp the scope and scale of what's really going on. And until we really understand that, we can't really think about solutions and how to fix this and how to deal with this. But I really do feel optimistic in many ways, because I think that we're at an inflection point, not just in America, but in sort of Western civilization in general, and that this accelerating climate crisis is going to force us, whether we want to or not, and to rethink everything about how we live, where we live, what we eat, how we vote. And I think that there are tremendous possibilities there and potential. And I'm always asked, you've been writing about climate change for 20 years. Why aren't you, an alcoholic living in your basement, bummed out about the future of civilization? It's because I meet amazing people all the time who are really doing great and inspired work at figuring out how to do things better. And I really do think that we have this opportunity, because so much is at stake, to really reinvent our world and build a better world. And I really think that if we want to do that, we can.
Jeff Goodell, author of The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Those were my conversations with Jen Szalai, our nonfiction critic, about several sciencey books that she's reviewed lately, as well as my talk with Jeff Goodell, author of the new bestseller, The Heat Will Kill You First. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.